Imagine digging in the sand and finding a brick, heavy, sun-baked for thousands of years, ancient. And carved into it are marks that don't look like decoration, but like code. Not a picture, not a symbol you recognize. Just sharp little wedges, repeated, ordered, deliberate. For centuries, nobody living could read them. And then, almost like a lock clicking open, people realized, this isn't ornament, this is writing. But here's the disturbing question. If this is writing, then who wrote it first? And how did an entire civilization, one that helped shape everything after it, become almost invisible to the modern world? Tonight, we follow those wedge marks back to their source, to a name that once changed history and then slipped into myth, Sumer. About 200 years ago, European archaeologists were digging through the Middle East, mostly in Egypt and the southern half of Mesopotamia, the land that makes up modern-day Iraq. They were searching for places that appeared in the Bible, in Greek historians like Herodotus, names everybody had heard, Babylon, Nineveh, Ur. But their exact locations were still uncertain to much of the West.
Look here, sir. I believe this is intact. Remarkable.
In the early 1800s, a series of discoveries began to pile up. An Englishman named Claudius James Rich mapped ruins at Babylon and Nineveh. He collected bricks, tablets, clay cylinders, boundary stones, covered in mysterious markings. And those markings weren't limited to Babylon and Nineveh. They appeared elsewhere, like Persepolis and the Behistun inscription in Iran, where they were accompanied by two other sets of equally strange marks. Scholars became convinced these weren't decorative patterns, they were the scripts of unknown languages. Eventually, one of the three scripts was deciphered, Old Persian, and once that key turned, the other two began to yield. The script found at Babylon and Nineveh turned out to be Akkadian, though many called it Babylonian at the time. The third language was Elamite, long extinct today. But as Akkadian texts began to be translated, a phrase kept showing up again and again. Sumer and Akkad, king of Sumer and Akkad, land of Sumer and Akkad. Akkad was a region, that was obvious. But Sumer, where was it? And who were the people of Sumer? The Sumerians, because some scholars began to suspect something bigger. What if this writing system, what we call cuneiform, was not invented by Akkadian-speaking Babylonians and Assyrians, but by an earlier, unknown people? The archaeologists didn't realize it yet, but they were standing at the edge of what some call the mother civilization of Mesopotamia, Sumer. To understand Sumer, you have to understand the scenage it rose on. Around 7,000 to 6,000 BC, people began moving south along the Tigris and Euphrates to the fertile floodplains of Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq and parts of northern Syria. Mesopotamia is Greek for land between rivers. And it's flat, very flat, built from thousands of years of silt laid down by constant flooding. That soil was, and still is, astonishingly fertile. Wheat, barley. With the right management, this land could feed populations far larger than earlier farming villages. But the same rivers that gave life also threatened it. Flooding could be unpredictable. So if you wanted stability, you needed organization, irrigation, storage, distribution. And that pressure, this constant negotiation with water, would push society towards something new. Larger communities, bigger systems, and eventually cities. Farming didn't begin from nothing here. Small-scale agriculture had already taken root across the Fertile Crescent, a stretch of productive land arching from the eastern Mediterranean through Turkey and down toward the Persian Gulf. In central Mesopotamia, the Sumer culture, roughly 6,500 to 5,500 BC, had already dug irrigation canals. The Halaf culture, around the same time, made beautiful pottery traded across the region, receiving obsidian, bitumen, seashells from afar. They also produced some of the earliest stamp seals. But after 6000 BC, changes in southern Mesopotamia accelerated, setting the stage for civilization as we know it. This is where the Ubaid culture appears, roughly 5,500 to 4,000 BC. The Ubaid people are especially important because they occupied the region immediately before the rise of the Sumerians. Most were small villages, but by the late 5th and early 4th millennium BC, some grew into towns of thousands. They built one-story houses, storage facilities, and, most intriguingly, central mounds with small buildings on top. Early temples, early institutions, early centralized places where goods, rituals, and power could gather. Ubaid pottery traveled astonishingly far, which means Ubaid influence did too. And one Ubaid site, more than any other, would later become legendary. A city associated with a god of wisdom and water. A place later people described as ancient, even in antiquity. Its name was Eridu. In later Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu was almost mythic, so ancient it sat at the edge of history and legend. The Sumerian king list opens with a line like a thunderclap. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. The details are clearly mythical, kings reigning for impossibly long spans, but the obsession with Eridu's age is telling. Archaeologists suggest the site may have been inhabited extremely early, deep into prehistory. During the Ubaid period, Eridu was a sensible place to settle. Farmland, fish from nearby marshes. And in those days, the Persian Gulf coastline lay farther inland than it does now, making the region feel almost like a watery paradise in an otherwise harsh landscape. It's easy to imagine the psychology of the early settlers, a place where fresh water, fertile soil, and food seem abundant, can feel sacred, a gift, a home of the divine. Eridu's patron god was Enki, god of fresh waters, sciences, technology, arts, wisdom, and famously had a soft spot for humankind. One of the central figures of the Sumerian pantheon. Excavations suggest Enki's earliest sanctuary was humble, just a small brick room. Ashes and fish bones found there may have been remnants of ritual offerings. Some archaeologists imagine communal feasts, prayers, singing, music, religion as social glue. As Eridu grew, the temple expanded and rose higher, layer upon layer, until the sanctuary became something monumental. The stepped temple tower we call a ziggurat. And here's the key. In Mesopotamia, a temple wasn't just a place you visited to worship. It was often the city's economic heart, its major landowner, storage center, redistribution hub, a religious institution, and an administrative machine, which leads us directly to the next leap. When towns become cities and cities become complex, you need a way to track everything. And that need, more than poetry, more than myth, will give birth to one of humanity's greatest inventions: writing. Less than 200 kilometers northwest of Eridu lies Uruk, the place many historians and archaeologists point to as the world's first true city. Sometime in the 4th millennium BC, Uruk underwent explosive growth. Surveys suggest that by around 3,500 BC, it may have housed 25,000 residents. Today, that's a modest city, but in 3,500 BC, that was an urban megacenter, a population almost unimaginable to earlier village communities. Historians call this rapid urban growth in southern Mesopotamia from roughly 4,000 to 3,100 BC, the Uruk period, or the Uruk phenomenon. It's also believed that during this time, a people of unknown origin entered the region and mixed with the local Ubaid population, adopting their culture and religion. They called themselves the Black-Headed People, Sa-Giga, and their homeland, Kiangir, Sumer. In earlier villages, power may have been held by councils of elders under a chief. But cities restructure everything. Society becomes layered, ruled by religious, military, and political elites. Uruk's early government, we don't know for certain, but scholars often imagine a top figure, like a priest king, holding both sacred and secular authority. Below him, priests, elite families, specialized workers, craftsmen, fishermen, farmers, herders, and later, the scribal class. Cities also changed production. In villages, pottery and textiles were often made at home. In cities, specialized artisans took over, producing goods in mass quantities, not always ornate, just functional, standardized. A famous example, the plain beveled rim bowls found at Uruk. Not pretty, but efficient. But how do you run a city? How do you collect, store, and redistribute goods? How do you track who owes what, who receives what, how many workers are assigned where? At a certain scale, spoken agreements aren't enough. You need something stronger than memory. You need records, and that is where writing begins. Here's the twist many people miss. Writing didn't start as literature. It started as bureaucracy. In the Uruk period, religion functioned as the organizing framework. Each city had a patron deity who, in theory, lived there on earth, at a shrine or temple. People gave the god goods, essentially taxes, often in wheat, barley, textiles, pottery, livestock. Then these goods were redistributed through the temple to the religious establishment, political elites, and eventually parts of the general population. As cities grew, redistribution became complicated. So temple administrators needed a way to track transactions. Goods coming in, goods going out, labor assigned, rations given. Around 3,300 BC, an early writing system appeared on small clay tablets. At first, it used pictographs, simple pictures representing commodities, grain, beer, livestock. We call this script proto-cuneiform. A bull's head could mean cattle. A barley stalk could mean barley. Sometimes signs were combined to create meaning by association, like a bowl sign plus a human head sign, meaning to eat. Over time, the shapes were adapted so scribes could write faster with a reed stylus, pressing wedge-like marks into soft clay. That's cuneiform. The tablets could be dried in the sun, hardening the impressions, making information permanent. And thanks to these documents, thousands of years later, we can still peer into ancient lives, their economies, their taxes, their disputes, their politics. And writing wasn't the only communication technology. There were also cylinder seals, small carved cylinders rolled over wet clay to leave a continuous imprint. They sealed storerooms, jars, boxes, baskets. They authenticated identity. They authorized documents, like signatures and security seals combined. But the Uruk phenomenon didn't stay inside southern Mesopotamia. It spread through trade colonies, reaching Syria, Iran, Turkey. Why? Because cities are hungry. They need materials they don't have locally: wood, stone, metal, precious stones. And when people compete for materials, they don't always negotiate peacefully. That's when another institution becomes unavoidable: kingship. Uruk-style influence appears across the Near East, often at sites showing Uruk pottery and architecture. Many scholars think these were trading colonies established to acquire raw materials: copper, obsidian, lead, gold, silver, wood, stone, and eventually tin for bronze. But as settlements grew, competition over farmland and resources intensified. Armed conflict between city-states became more common. Priests could organize labor and collect offerings, claiming to represent the gods. But no amount of divine ritual guarantees physical security. Being pious doesn't make you a warrior or strategist. So societies began to elevate a new kind of leader, someone who could rally men, lead armies, and defend territory. That is how the first kings emerged. At first, kingship may have been temporary, needed during war, but eventually it became hereditary. By around 2900 BC, kings were commonplace in Sumer. This marks the start of the early dynastic period, lasting nearly 6 centuries. Rulers used titles like Ensi, and Lugal, with Lugal often meaning great man, a more powerful king. Cities built high walls. Inside were temples, administrative buildings, palaces, homes, and towering above all, the ziggurat, not just a worship site, but the supposed earthly home of the city's god, and often the richest institution. The gods themselves were described in human terms: emotional, jealous, sometimes petty. There were hundreds: gods for sky, sun, moon, and for plows, bricks, writing. Uruk's key goddess was Inanna, love and war. But by the early dynastic period, many viewed Enlil, Lord Wind, god of the air, as supreme, with his sanctuary in Nippur. Enki remained powerful in Eridu. Utu was associated with justice. Nana ruled the moon in Ur, and Ningirsu stood as patron of Lagash. By around 2500 BC, royal inscriptions and even portraits of kings begin to appear, giving us fragments of political history. One key figure is Ur-Nanshe of Lagash, believed to have reigned around 2494 to 2465 BC. A famous relief shows him with a basket of bricks on his head, depicting the king performing sacred duties, building and maintaining temples, especially those of Lagash's patron god, Ningirsu. But kings weren't just builders. They were military leaders. Lagash entered a long conflict with neighboring Umma, fighting over fertile land between them. Texts speak of boundary stones being placed, torn out, replaced again, and the disputes are framed not only as human politics, but as conflicts between the patron gods of each city. One of the most vivid monuments is the Stele of the Vultures, a work of Sumerian art depicting the conflict in brutal detail, showing Lagash victorious over Umma. This is what politics looks like when cities are young. Borders are not lines on a map. They are canals, stones, fields, and bodies. And memory is kept not by historians, but by monuments and temple archives. But here's the problem with these sources. We almost never get both sides. We know Lagash's story. We don't really know Umma's, and that's a reminder. Ancient history often forces modern historians to play connect the dots. Even then, big questions remain unanswered. Beyond Lagash and Umma, other cities mattered enormously. Two of the most prominent were and Nippur. Is famous for two reasons. It appears in the Bible as Abraham's birthplace, and in the 1920s, archaeologists led by Leonard Woolley uncovered spectacular tombs there. Royal graves dating around 2600 BC contained gold, weapons, intricate jewelry, chariots, sculptures, musical instruments, board games, remarkably intact. Some tombs included dozens of attendants and soldiers buried with the ruler, possibly sacrificed or forced to die to accompany their master into the afterlife. Whether they went willingly remains unknown, and why this happened here and not elsewhere in Mesopotamia is still debated. Then there's Nippur, the holy city, home to Enlil's temple. It's often described as politically neutral, a place kings visited to gain divine legitimacy by gifting the sanctuary. But as in many societies, inequality deepened over time. The divide between rich and poor widened. And sometimes that pressure doesn't produce reform. It produces explosion. In the 24th century BC, Lagash experienced unrest and upheaval. A dynasty collapsed, priests came to power, and eventually a priestly ruler, and then Entarzi, took control. Corruption spread. His successor, Lugalanda, took it further. Land and temple wealth concentrated under his control. Dissenters were removed. Heavy taxes appeared on everyday life, on weddings, even funerals. Documents suggest debts became crushing. Some impoverished parents reportedly sold children into slavery to survive. After 6 years of this, Lugalanda was overthrown by Urukagina. Urukagina presented himself as a reformer, a man of the people. He's often associated with one of the earliest known written law codes, though the actual code hasn't been found, only referenced. Texts describe him banning officials from seizing boats, donkeys, sheep, fisheries, restraining the power of monopolists and collectors. This is one of the earliest moments where we hear something like this idea. Power should have limits. Even in the world's first cities. But Lagash's reforms came too late, because its weakness did not go unnoticed, and its old rival, Umma, was about to strike back. In 2341 BC, a man named Lugalzagesi became ruler of Umma. In his second year, he attacked and conquered Lagash, possibly as vengeance after centuries of conflict. His men burned, plundered, and destroyed Lagash's capital and holy places, including the great temple of Ningirsu. A scribe from Lagash lamented the destruction and cursed Lugalzagesi, begging gods to make him bear the sins. But Lugalzagesi didn't stop there. He claimed he controlled lands from the lower sea, the Persian Gulf, to the upper sea, the Mediterranean. In inscriptions, he frames his rule as divinely granted, unrivaled, peaceful across the world. Modern scholars doubt he truly controlled everything he claimed, but the ambition is real. He wanted to be remembered as the first great empire builder. The tragedy for him is, history remembers someone else. Someone not Sumerian. Someone who came from the north. Someone whose birth name we don't even know. Someone who called himself the legitimate king. We know him as Sargon of Akkad. Sargon the Great. Sargon's early life is wrapped in myth. A story says his mother was a priestess, and she set him adrift in a basket on the Euphrates. He was rescued by a gardener who raised him. Later, he became cupbearer to the king of Kish. Whether that story is literal or political legend, the message is clear. Sargon's myth insists he did not come from noble birth. He rose, and he wants you to know it. At the time, Lugalzagesi was consolidating Sumer with Uruk as his capital. Sargon marched south from Kish, defeated Uruk, captured Lugalzagesi. The Sumerian king list says Uruk was defeated and the kingship taken to Agade. Sargon reigned for 56 years. In inscriptions attributed to him, Sargon describes defeating city after city, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, pushing as far as the sea. With Sargon's conquest around 2334 BC, the early dynastic period ends. And unlike Lugalzagesi, many scholars believe Sargon's empire truly reached from the Persian Gulf toward the Mediterranean and beyond. But conquest is only half the story. The bigger story is what conquest did to Sumer. The Akkadians came from a region north of Sumer Akkad, covering much of central and northern Iraq today. They had lived alongside Sumerians for centuries and likely formed significant populations in Sumer's own cities. They spoke Akkadian, an East Semitic language, more easily understood by modern linguists than Sumerian, which is a language isolate. When Sargon conquered Sumer, he made Akkadian the official language and adopted the Sumerian script, Cuneiform, to write it. Sumerian didn't vanish overnight, but it began to be replaced in daily official life. Sargon broke the power of the priesthood, local rulers, and Sumerian nobility, replacing them with Akkadian governors loyal to him. He and his successors reorganized and redistributed temple lands, weakening the old religious power structure that had dominated city administration. Sargon also shifted the center of civilization by building a new capital, Akkad, also called Agade, on the Euphrates. It became a political and economic hub. Boats bringing goods from Dilmun and Magan, modern Bahrain and Oman, caravans from Anatolia, Elam, Arabia, the Levant. Tax systems were reformed so revenue flowed to Agade first, then redistributed, often at the expense of older Sumerian cities that had once been wealthy power centers. Sargon ruled tightly from 2334 to 2279 BC. After his death, rebellions broke out. His sons struggled. Even with later stabilization under his grandson Naram-Sin, the empire's grip eventually weakened. And then, like many states, Akkad approached a point where it could no longer hold itself together.
The Kushans will never accept it.
Late Akkadian records describe a chaotic time, kings with short reigns, uncertain lineages. Then the people from the Zagros Mountains, the Gutians, swept in, overthrew the last Akkadian rulers, and destroyed Akkad. But the story may be more complicated than a single invasion. Some interpretations suggest severe drought and famine destabilized both Sumer and Akkad, collapsing regional economies. When food systems fail, unrest follows. When unrest spreads, central authority breaks. Provinces secede one by one, dominoes falling. In that chaos, outsiders like the Gutians may have found opportunity. Raid, plunder, seize territory, demand tribute. The Sumerian king list describes Gutian kings, many otherwise unknown. Material evidence for Gutian rule is scarce, suggesting their control may have been limited, indirect, or uneven. And yet, in the post-Akkadian world, some regions appear to have flourished. One of them, Lagash, under a ruler named Gudea. Gudea presented himself not as a conquering terror, but as a shepherd. He claimed to build temples for the gods, especially Ningirsu. A stark contrast to earlier royal boasting about slaughter and conquest. Still, Gutian rule was never fully accepted, and eventually the Sumerians organized to push them out. A local ruler from Uruk named Utu-Hegel organized a force to end the Gutian presence. An inscription attributed to him calls the Gutians snake and scorpion of the mountain and claims divine mandate to destroy them. The text describes Utu-Hegel defeating Gutian forces and capturing their leader Tiragan, brought back blindfolded and humiliated, Utu-Hegel placing his foot on his neck.
Victory to Sumer!
It declares kingship returns to Sumer. Utu-Hegel founded Uruk's 5th dynasty, but he died shortly after, reportedly while inspecting canals. He was succeeded by his son-in-law, the former governor of Ur-Nammu. In 2112 BC, Ur-Nammu founded what historians call the 3rd dynasty of Ur, or Ur III, opening the Neo-Sumerian period. Ur-Nammu annexed cities, rebuilt institutions, and, crucially, he is associated with one of the earliest written law codes in history. Even in damaged form, the surviving copy reveals a striking pattern. Many crimes are punished by fines, silver payments, while the most serious offenses could draw death. A law code does something powerful in the human mind. It turns violence from personal revenge into institutional consequence. It creates predictability. And predictability is the psychological foundation of a stable state. Ur-Nammu is also linked to a Sumerian renaissance, reversing earlier Akkadian cultural dominance and promoting Sumerian language and identity again. Old epics and hymns were revived and performed. New works composed. Great construction projects expanded temples and monuments, including the famous ziggurat at Ur. But the true peak of Ur III came under Ur-Nammu's son, Shulgi. Shulgi reigned for 47 years, roughly 2094 to 2047 BTC, and he was a character, to put it mildly. Hymns praise him in first person as a prodigy. I am the king from the womb. I am the lion. I am king of the 4 corners. These hymns were sung in temples and public, designed to inspire devotion and faith. Shulgi as shepherd, protector, even God. But Ur III's real strength wasn't supernatural. It was administrative. This period left an extraordinary amount of documentation, around 100,000 texts translated, with thousands more still waiting. Economy, agriculture, manufacturing, construction, trade, distribution, troop deployments, taxation, law. Most are government documents, so we don't always see just private life clearly, but we see the state machinery in detail. Taxes weren't primarily paid in precious metals. They were paid in goods, grain, livestock, textiles, pottery. And provinces didn't all pay at once. That would overwhelm the bureaucracy. Instead, provinces paid in a rotating schedule called Bala exchange. Each month, a different province contributed, ensuring steady income throughout the year. Shulgi also campaigned militarily into Elam, influencing cities like Susa and Anshan, reaching even distant places. For much of his reign, the empire was stable and prosperous. But after Shulgi's death, that stability began to unravel. Shulgi's successors struggled to hold the system together. At first, decline was gradual under Amarsin, but rebellions became more common under the next king, Shusin. And one pressure made everything worse. The steady migration of a people known as the Amorites, called Martu in Sumerian. The settled, urban Sumerians, who believed they had reached the pinnacle of civilization, looked at these nomadic newcomers with contempt. One Neo-Sumerian text describes them harshly. To people who know no grain, no house, no city, who eat raw meat, who don't cultivate, who aren't buried properly. That's the classic civilizational fear. When a society feels fragile, it labels outsiders as chaos itself. The Amorites were Semitic speakers from the west, the Levant. They had been migrating into Mesopotamia since at least Shulgi's reign. Shulgi even ordered what some consider history's first real border wall to keep them out. It didn't work. By the reign of III's last king, Ibisin, the Amorites weren't just present. They were taking over towns and cities, creating local power bases. At the same time, the empire's periphery broke away. And in Elam, a former official appointed by Shulgi declared independence, then marched west. By 2004 BC, Ibisin ruled an empire in name only. In reality, his authority barely extended beyond Ur and its immediate surroundings.
Forward! Destroy the gates! Run! They are burning the city!
Then came the final blow. An Elamite army advanced from Susa, sacked Ur, and took Ibisin prisoner back to Elam. We don't know what happened to him. Execution is likely. But we do know what happened to Sumer as a state. The Neo-Sumerian Empire of Ur III had come to an end. And with the fall of the last true Sumerian state, something subtle and devastating began. Without state support, Sumerian culture and identity began to fade. In the centuries after Ur III, Mesopotamia fractured into smaller kingdoms, many ruled by Amorite clans. Because their language was close to Akkadian became even more widespread. By around 1800 BC, Sumerian ceased to exist as a spoken language, but it did not vanish completely. Scribes kept it alive as a scholarly and religious language, taught in scribal schools for a very long time afterward. A new civilization, Babylonian, developed, blending Sumerian and Akkadian worlds with newcomers like the Amorites. And Sumer's influence did not stop with Babylon or Assyria. It permeated Mesopotamian religion, culture, administration, across centuries. Because even if Sumer disappeared as a nation, its inventions had already escaped into history. So when those early archaeologists brushed sand off a clay tablet and saw wedge marks staring back at them, they weren't just finding ruins, they were finding voices. Sumer gave us early large-scale farming, tools like the plow, urban planning, mass production of everyday goods, mathematics, and accounting, and perhaps its most famous contribution of all, writing, the ability to store thought outside the human brain, to make memory permanent, to leave a message thousands of years into the future. And that's what those wedge marks really are, a message from the first cities, still insisting, across time, we were here and we wrote. If you want, the next episode can dive deeper into Sumerian religion, the the gods, the ziggurats, and how belief became government. And of course, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Thanks for watching.